The sharp, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, a low thrum that spoke of hidden power. Carol, the freshly minted HOA president, strode confidently across what she confidently believed was newly acquired common land, her smile wide and self-satisfied. She envisioned a pristine, minimalist community garden here, right on what had always been my backyard. Her designer loafers barely scuffed the dewy grass as she approached the subtle, almost invisible boundary I had put in place. One step, then another, and then, with a yelp that echoed surprisingly loudly in the morning quiet, she stumbled back. Her arms flailed wildly, a startled cry escaping her lips, and her eyes, usually narrowed with judgment, were wide with a mix of shock and confusion. A strange, vibrating sensation shot up her leg, making her hop on one foot as if she'd stepped on something scalding hot. She stared, aghast, at the perfectly manicured lawn, then at her tingling foot. What in the world had just happened? And how could a simple patch of grass suddenly feel like it had bitten her? Just 2 years prior, life in Willow Creek seemed like a dream spun from glossy real estate brochures. My name is Alex, and my partner, Jamie, and I had packed up our lives from the bustling city, seeking a quieter existence, a place where the air smelled of fresh-cut grass instead of exhaust fumes, and where the loudest noise was the distant laughter of children. Willow Creek, with its winding streets, mature oak trees, and houses boasting quaint front porches, felt like a perfect fit. The local real estate agent, a jovial woman named Brenda, had painted a picture of neighborly potlucks, evening strolls, and a community that truly cared for one another. It was exactly what we craved after years of cramped apartments and anonymous city living. Our house, a charming, somewhat older craftsman-style home with a sprawling backyard, instantly captured our hearts. It had character, unlike the cookie-cutter houses that dominated some of the newer developments. The backyard, especially, was a canvas waiting for our touch, a large, irregular shape that sloped gently down to a small, babbling creek at the very back, its boundary clearly marked by an old, weathered wooden fence that had stood for decades. We envisioned raised garden beds, a cozy fire pit, and maybe even a small reading nook under the shade of the ancient willow tree by the water. The thought of spending weekends tending to our own patch of earth, watching birds flock to feeders, filled us with a quiet joy. Moving in was a whirlwind of cardboard boxes and endless trips to hardware stores. But amidst the chaos, the warmth of the neighborhood began to shine through. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly lady from across the street, brought over a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the oven, on our very first day. "Welcome to Willow Creek, dearies," she'd chirped, her eyes twinkling. Her husband, Mr. Henderson, helped Jamie carry in a particularly heavy couch, refusing any offers of payment, simply saying, "That's what neighbors are for." These small acts of kindness reinforced our belief that we had found our forever home, a true haven where community spirit thrived. We felt a sense of belonging almost immediately, a comforting feeling that we had chosen wisely. The first HOA meeting we attended was held in the small community clubhouse, a building that looked more like a charming oversized cottage than a stuffy meeting hall. Jamie and I went, curious to understand the local rules and eager to meet more of our new neighbors. The air was thick with the scent of lukewarm coffee and the excited chatter of residents. That's where we first met Carol. She was a woman in her late 40s, immaculately dressed, with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and an air of unmistakable authority. She had recently been elected as the new HOA president, replacing a beloved, laid-back gentleman named Richard, who had apparently moved out of state. Carol took the podium with a flourish, her smile bright, almost too bright, and her voice, though pleasant enough, carried an underlying tone of rigid determination. "Good evening, everyone," she announced, her voice booming slightly through the small microphone. "I'm Carol Jenkins, your new HOA president. I'm so excited to lead Willow Creek into a new era of elegance and uniformity." Her speech was filled with phrases like, upholding community standards, enhancing property values, and ensuring aesthetic harmony. She unveiled a series of proposed new rules, mandatory bi-weekly lawn treatments, only approved by a specific, expensive vendor, a strict color palette for exterior house paint, a choice of 3 shades of beige or 2 shades of gray, and even regulations on the size and placement of garden gnomes. Jamie nudged me under the table, a slight frown on his face. I shrugged, figuring it was just standard HOA stuff, a little overbearing perhaps, but nothing too concerning. Every community had rules, after all, and I was willing to abide by reasonable ones. We just wanted peace. Over the next few months, Carol's reign truly began to unfold. The trickle of friendly, innocuous notices from the old HOA management turned into a steady stream of brightly colored, official-looking letters from Carol. Each one seemed to highlight a new infraction, a tiny deviation from her increasingly stringent vision of aesthetic harmony. Our neighbor, David, a young father of 2, received a stern warning for a small, tasteful planter box on his porch that Carol deemed excessive. Poor old Martha, who had lived in Willow Creek for 50 years, was told her beloved, slightly faded bird bath was non-compliant and had to be removed. The once vibrant and relaxed atmosphere of the community began to feel strained, a low hum of anxiety replacing the easygoing chatter. Residents started to eye each other warily, wondering who would be next to receive a friendly reminder from Carol. One afternoon, I was out pulling weeds from our front garden when Robert, another neighbor who lived 2 houses down, walked by with his dog, a sleepy golden retriever named Buster. He stopped, leaned against our fence, and gave a weary sigh. "How are you holding up with all the new developments?" he asked, his voice low. I chuckled, admitting that some of the rules felt a bit much. Robert nodded gravely. "You know," he began, lowering his voice even further, "before Carol became president, she was on the board for a few years. There was a big kerfuffle with the old board about a strip of land behind the O'Malley's house. Carol was convinced it was common property, wanted to put in a sculpture garden or some such thing. It turned out the O'Malleys had a deed proving it was theirs, and the whole thing blew over. But she was persistent. Very persistent." He shook his head, gave a small, humorless laugh, and then continued his walk, leaving me with a faint unease that settled in my stomach. Was Carol really the type to try and claim land that wasn't hers? It seemed absurd, almost cartoonish. Despite the growing tension, Jamie and I decided to move forward with our backyard plans. We loved our home, and we weren't going to let a bit of HOA overreach stop us from making it our own. We decided to build a small, rustic shed near the back of our property, perfect for storing gardening tools and protecting our new lawnmower. And, since the old wooden fence at the back, near the creek, was practically falling apart, we opted to replace it with a sturdy, tasteful new fence that perfectly matched the style of our house. We diligently checked the local city ordinances, pulled all the necessary permits, and ensured our new fence would be built exactly on our established property line, well within our deeded land. We deliberately didn't run it by the HOA, mostly because the city permits were sufficient, and we didn't want to give Carol another opportunity to nitpick. We thought we were being smart, proactive, and perfectly within our rights. The construction of the shed and fence began smoothly. Jamie and I spent our weekends digging post holes, mixing concrete, and nailing planks, enjoying the physical labor and the satisfaction of building something with our own hands. The new fence looked fantastic, a clean, crisp line delineating our property, clearly marking where our land ended and the shared creek area began. We felt a renewed sense of pride in our home. Then, the brightly colored envelope arrived, tucked securely into our mailbox. It was from the HOA, of course, but this one felt different. Heavier. More ominous. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. The letter, penned in Carol's signature elegant script, was formal, stern, and utterly unbelievable. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that our new fence was built partially on community common area, specifically claiming a significant portion of our backyard, extending from our old fence line all the way to the creek, as now belonging to the HOA. The letter then boldly announced that construction would begin on a new Willow Creek community walking path and reflection garden on this newly claimed common area, our backyard, in exactly 2 weeks. It ended with a chilling line: any structures or plantings currently within this designated common area must be removed by the homeowner immediately, or they will be removed by the HOA's appointed contractors. My jaw dropped. She wasn't just nitpicking anymore. Carol Jenkins was trying to take our land. Chapter 2. The official-looking envelope, still clutched in my trembling hand, felt strangely heavy, as if weighted with all the audacity contained within its pages. Jamie, seeing the color drain from my face, quickly came to my side. He took the letter, his brow furrowing as he read Carol's audacious claim. The quiet calm of our home shattered, replaced by an immediate, visceral shock. His eyes scanned the lines, then darted to mine, a mixture of disbelief and outrage warring in their depths. "She can't be serious," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, yet tight with simmering anger. We read it again, together this time, each word a fresh sting. The phrase, "community common area," mocked us, laid out in bold, undeniable print. Our backyard, our private sanctuary, was now, according to Carol, destined for a Willow Creek community walking path and reflection garden. The gall of it, the sheer, unbridled nerve, stole our breath. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war on our peace, on our very sense of ownership. Disbelief quickly morphed into a furious determination. This was our home, our land, purchased with hard-earned savings, and backed by a clear deed. We laid out our old property deed, the intricate survey maps from when we bought the house, and even an aerial photo we'd kept from the real estate listing. We traced the boundaries with our fingers, confirming what we already knew in our hearts: every inch of that backyard, right down to the old creek bed, was unequivocally ours. The old fence, now replaced with our sturdy new one, had always marked the property line. Carol's claim was baseless, a fabrication designed to seize land for some grand, self-aggrandizing project. The injustice of it burned, a hot coal in our chests. How could someone simply decide to take what wasn't theirs? It felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything we understood about living in a civilized community. Our first impulse was to confront Carol directly, to march over to her perfectly manicured house and demand an explanation. But cooler heads, or at least slightly less furious ones, prevailed. We decided to approach it formally, rationally. I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA, copying our deed and survey documents. The letter calmly explained that our property lines were clearly established and recorded with the county, and that any claim of common area in our backyard was erroneous. We requested that Carol retract her demand and cease any plans to develop our private property. It felt like a reasonable step, an appeal to common sense and legality. We believed that once she saw the irrefutable evidence, she would realize her mistake and back down. We were still trying to believe in the good of people, in the possibility of a simple misunderstanding. While we waited for a response, the tension in the neighborhood felt almost palpable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. More notices of non-compliance were flying around, tiny flags planted by Carol in the lives of our neighbors. Mr. Henderson, who had helped us move in, had received a fine for a small, chipped bird bath, a cherished family heirloom. Mrs. Henderson had been distraught. Robert, our other neighbor, confided in me that Carol had tried to make him cut down a healthy oak tree on his property because it obstructed the view from the street, even though it was well within his boundaries and posed no hazard. He had resisted, but the constant pressure was taking its toll. He looked tired, worn down by the petty tyranny. We shared our story with them, and their faces fell. "She's trying it again," Robert murmured, shaking his head. "She did this with the O'Malleys, too. Always after land for her projects. She thinks she owns the whole neighborhood." Their sympathy was a small comfort, but it came with a heavy dose of shared helplessness. They had no answers, no solutions, only the grim knowledge that Carol was a relentless force. Days stretched into a week, then 10 days, with no word from Carol or the HOA. The silence was unnerving, more menacing than a direct confrontation. We checked the mailbox constantly, hoping for a sign that she had seen reason. Instead, the 2-week deadline she had given us loomed larger with each passing day. Jamie started having trouble sleeping, often waking in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, worry etched on his face. "What if she just sends them anyway?" he'd whisper, the thought a cold dread in the quiet darkness. I tried to reassure him, but a similar fear gnawed at my own peace. We had played by the rules, we had been polite, but it seemed Carol played by a different set of rules entirely. Then, one crisp morning, just 2 days before Carol's self-imposed deadline, a small, white utility van pulled up at the curb in front of our house. 2 men in work uniforms emerged, carrying rolls of bright orange tape and metal stakes. They glanced at a clipboard, then at our backyard, and then, without so much as a knock on our door, they began to walk around the perimeter of our property, right along the new fence line, unrolling the vibrant tape and hammering the stakes into the ground. They were marking out the exact area Carol had claimed in her letter, our backyard, the land leading down to the creek, the very spot where we had envisioned our quiet reading nook. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and fury. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a deliberate act of aggression, a physical encroachment. Carol wasn't waiting for a reply, wasn't acknowledging our legal ownership. She was simply proceeding as if our land was already hers, as if our rights meant nothing. The bright orange tape, stark against the green grass, felt like a public declaration of war, a blatant act of trespass right there for all our neighbors to see. My blood ran cold, then boiled with righteous anger. This was it. The time for polite letters and appeals to reason was clearly over. The sight of those orange stakes, hammered into our private lawn, felt like a physical blow. My breath hitched in my throat, a knot of pure rage tightening in my stomach. Jamie rushed out, equally stunned, his face a mask of disbelief. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice ringing with indignation as he approached the 2 workers, who paused, seemingly unfazed. One of them, a burly man with a disinterested expression, simply pointed to a document on his clipboard. "HOA directive, sir. This land's been designated for community use. We're just marking the perimeter for the new walking path." He spoke with a practiced monotony, as if reciting a well-rehearsed line, utterly devoid of empathy. The other man continued hammering stakes, his actions a clear message: they weren't asking for permission, they were taking. It was a brazen act of defiance against our clear property rights, a public humiliation intended to send a message not just to us, but to anyone else in Willow Creek who might dare to challenge Carol. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. Our polite letter, our careful documentation, our appeals to reason, none of it mattered. Carol was escalating, pushing us to the brink, and she was doing it with a cold, calculated efficiency that made our blood run cold. We stood there, helpless, watching as our backyard was systematically carved up, marked as if it were a conquered territory. The neighbors started to notice, too. We saw curtains twitching in nearby windows, and a few residents paused their morning walks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. No one intervened, no one spoke up, their silence a chilling testament to Carol's power over the community. It was a lonely feeling, standing there, seemingly abandoned, while our property was being encroached upon right before our eyes. The feeling of being cornered, of being powerless, was almost unbearable. That evening, the air in our house was thick with despair. We sat at the kitchen table, the orange stakes now a stark reminder visible from our window. "What do we do, Alex?" Jamie asked, his voice raw with frustration. "She's not going to stop. She clearly doesn't care about our deed, or about right and wrong." The thought of losing a significant chunk of our backyard, the very space we had dreamt of making our own, was devastating. Our dream of a peaceful haven in Willow Creek felt like it was crumbling before our eyes. We talked for hours, weighing every option. Lawyers seemed like the obvious choice, but the thought of a long, drawn-out legal battle, expensive and emotionally draining, filled us with dread. We had moved here for peace, not for endless court dates. Besides, even if we won, would we ever truly feel at home again, knowing we had to constantly fight our own HOA? A deep sense of injustice gnawed at me. Carol was a bully, using her position to take advantage of others, and it wasn't just about our land. It was about Martha's bird bath, David's planter, Robert's tree. It was about every small act of kindness and community spirit she had slowly chipped away at since becoming president. My mind replayed Robert's story about the O'Malleys, how Carol had tried to claim their land too. It hit me then, with a startling clarity, this wasn't just about land, it was about control. It was about breaking people's will, making them fall in line. I realized that fighting her with legal paperwork alone might win the battle, but it wouldn't send the clear, undeniable message she needed to hear. It wouldn't protect others from her future grabs. I needed to do something that was undeniably mine, undeniably legal, and undeniably effective. Something that would make her think twice before ever stepping foot on our land again. The next few days were a blur of intense research. I dove into local property laws, HOA regulations, and even obscure municipal codes. I learned about property easements, adverse possession, and the precise definitions of what constituted a boundary. My living room transformed into a makeshift war room, covered in maps, legal documents, and highlighted passages from online law libraries. Jamie, though still wary, helped me, his initial despair slowly giving way to a shared sense of purpose. We discovered a fascinating, little-known provision in our county's property code regarding defensive measures on private property, especially concerning repeated trespass or attempted encroachment. It was a niche piece of legislation, designed mostly for rural properties dealing with livestock or persistent nuisance, but its wording, with careful interpretation, seemed to apply. It stated that a landowner could implement non-lethal, clearly marked deterrence on their property line if there was documented evidence of repeated attempts at encroachment or trespass. The key was non-lethal and clearly marked. This little-known law sparked an idea, a bold, almost outrageous solution that began to form in my mind. It was radical, unconventional, but it felt right. It felt like the only way to send an unmistakable message to Carol: this is our land, and you are not welcome here. It was a plan that required precision, careful installation, and an absolute commitment to staying within legal bounds. It needed to be a physical barrier, something that would cause a clear, immediate reaction, but without causing actual harm. We were not looking for revenge, merely for protection. We were drawing a line in the sand, a boundary that could not be ignored or disputed. It was a drastic measure, born out of desperation, but a necessary one, I felt, to reclaim our peace and protect our home. The day before Carol's deadline, a new type of truck pulled up to our house, this one unmarked, discreet. A man with a quiet demeanor stepped out, carrying specialized equipment. We had hired him after careful consideration and a discreet consultation, explaining our unusual predicament without revealing too many details. He was an expert in his field, understanding the nuances of low-voltage, high-impact deterrents designed for security rather than offense. He spent the better part of the day working along our fence line, installing a system that would be invisible to the naked eye but undeniably present. It involved discrete wiring, carefully insulated, running just below the ground and along the base of our new fence, connected to a subtle, low-voltage power source in our shed. We also put up several small, discreet, but clearly worded signs at regular intervals along the boundary, as required by law, stating simply, private property. Boundary protected by non-lethal deterrent system. They were unobtrusive, blending with the natural surroundings, but they were there. It was done. The trap, so to speak, was set. We had exhausted all polite avenues. Now, it was time to let our property speak for itself. We waited, our nerves stretched thin, for Carol's inevitable arrival. Chapter 4. The morning sun, usually a comforting sight, felt unusually harsh as it streamed through our windows, highlighting the nervous tension that had settled over our home. Jamie and I ate breakfast in near silence, the clinking of forks against plates sounding unnaturally loud. Every rustle outside, every distant car door slamming, made us jump. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent countdown ticking away towards Carol's self-imposed deadline. We had done all we could, legally and physically, to protect our land. Now, all that was left was to wait. I kept glancing out the window, my eyes drawn to the telltale orange stakes that marked the line of contention, a silent dare to anyone who dared to cross it. The small, discreet signs we had placed were almost invisible from a distance, yet they carried a powerful, unspoken warning. Just after 9 o'clock, a sleek black SUV, sparkling clean and undeniably expensive, glided slowly down our street and pulled to a stop directly in front of our house. It was Carol's car, unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat, a sudden surge of adrenaline making my hands clammy. Jamie reached across the table and squeezed my hand, a silent gesture of support. Carol emerged from the vehicle, not alone this time. Trailing behind her were two men in dark suits, carrying clipboards, looking like a pair of stern, humorless bodyguards. They were clearly not construction workers, these were the legal enforcers, her private army. Carol herself was dressed impeccably, a sharp business suit tailored to perfection, her blonde bob unruffled by the morning breeze. She wore a look of triumphant determination, a smug satisfaction that seemed to say, "I told you so." This was her moment, her public demonstration of authority. Carol led her entourage directly towards our backyard, marching with an air of absolute ownership. She didn't bother to approach our front door, didn't offer a single word of greeting or explanation. She simply pointed towards the orange stakes, her arms sweeping grandly as if presenting a newly conquered kingdom. The two men in suits, stone-faced, began to consult their clipboards, nodding deferentially to Carol's every pronouncement. We watched from our living room window, a mix of apprehension and grim resolve warring within us. This was the moment. She stepped purposefully, confidently, directly over the line marked by the orange tape, her expensive loafer landing squarely on what she believed was her new, community common area. That's when it happened. A sharp, audible yelp sliced through the morning quiet. Carol froze mid-stride, her body stiffening instantly. Her eyes, wide with surprise, darted to her foot, which seemed to be vibrating uncontrollably. A strange, tingling sensation shot up her leg, making her gasp. She stumbled back quickly, a half-formed cry escaping her lips, her face contorting from smug confidence to utter bewilderment. The two men behind her paused, looking confused, unsure of what had just occurred. Carol hopped on one foot, shaking the other as if trying to dislodge something unseen. Her perfect composure had vanished in an instant, replaced by a flustered indignation. She glared at the ground, then at her tingling foot, then back at the perfectly innocent-looking patch of grass. "What was that?" she sputtered, her voice higher than usual, her composure completely shattered. The men in suits exchanged glances, clearly as baffled as she was. Carol, visibly shaken, took another tentative step, trying to test the invisible force. Again, a smaller but undeniable jolt made her snatch her foot back, her eyes widening further. She looked around, utterly perplexed, searching for a visible culprit, for anything that could explain the bizarre sensation. She saw nothing but green grass and our new fence. The air still carried that faint, almost imperceptible hum, a silent guardian protecting our rightful boundary. After a few more futile, cautious attempts to step onto the disputed territory, each met with the same unpleasant jolt, Carol's face turned a shade of mottled red. Her triumphant smirk had been replaced by a furious scowl, her eyes narrowed not in judgment, but in frustrated confusion. She glared at our house, at our new fence, then back at the invisible barrier. It was clear she was completely mystified, unable to comprehend what unseen force was repelling her. She finally threw her hands up in exasperation, spun on her heel, and stalked back to her SUV, her movements jerky and agitated. The two men in suits, looking equally bewildered, scrambled to follow her, their clipboards now seeming useless. The sleek black SUV sped away, leaving behind only the orange stakes and a palpable sense of triumph in our hearts. Jamie and I stared at each other, then burst into relieved laughter. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but one born of sheer, unadulterated relief and a surprising sense of justice. It was a victory, small yet significant, achieved without a single word, without confrontation, simply by letting our property defend itself. The fear that had gripped us for weeks slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. We had protected our home. But we knew, with a certainty that chilled us even through our relief, that Carol Jenkins was not one to give up easily. She would be back, angrier and more determined than ever. The electrified fences had done their job for now, but this was merely the first skirmish in a much larger war. The quiet hum along our property line served as a warning to her, and a promise to ourselves, that we would not be pushed around. The days following Carol's electrifying encounter were filled with an uneasy quiet, a stillness that felt more like the calm before a storm than true peace. Jamie and I found ourselves constantly peering out the windows, half expecting to see Carol's black SUV reappear, or perhaps a squadron of her HOA minions. We chuckled quietly whenever we remembered her bewildered expression, the way her perfect composure had crumbled right there on our lawn. It was a small, satisfying victory, but we both knew Carol Jenkins wasn't someone who easily accepted defeat. Her humiliation, public and unexpected, would only fuel her determination to reclaim what she, in her twisted logic, believed was rightfully hers. The signs on our property, subtle yet clear, were a constant reminder of the invisible boundary, a silent sentinel protecting our land. True to our predictions, Carol didn't stay quiet for long. A week later, a new letter arrived, thicker and more formal than the last. This time, it wasn't just a threat, it was a formal notice of a special HOA meeting, called specifically to address unauthorized property modifications and potential hazards within the community. The thinly veiled accusation was clearly directed at us. The letter also included a veiled threat about enforcement actions and legal remedies available to the HOA. It was a clear escalation, moving the battleground from our backyard to the public forum of the community meeting. Carol wasn't just trying to take our land anymore, she was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against us, painting us as rule breakers and a danger to the community. We knew we had to attend. Ignoring it would be seen as an admission of guilt. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse, usually half empty, was packed. Every chair was taken, and people stood along the walls, whispering amongst themselves. The air buzzed with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Carol, standing at the podium, looked even more formidable than usual, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with an air of absolute control. She began her speech, her voice dripping with false concern, talking about maintaining property values and the safety of children. Then, she pivoted, her tone becoming grave. She spoke of unexplained incidents and dangerous, unregulated installations that posed a risk to innocent residents. She didn't mention our names directly, but the thinly veiled allusions to our property were unmistakable, prompting glances and murmurs from the crowd directed our way. Jamie and I sat there, trying to remain calm, as she launched into a carefully crafted narrative, painting us as reckless and inconsiderate neighbors. She described the mysterious electrical currents that had assaulted her, twisting the facts to make it sound like we had installed some kind of harmful, unregulated device designed to injure people. She showed photos of the orange stakes in our yard, claiming they were a prelude to an illegal structure. She then dramatically unveiled a laminated map, a highly exaggerated version of our property, with a huge, ominous red X drawn over the entire portion of our backyard she coveted. The room buzzed with whispers. Many residents looked confused, some outright alarmed by Carol's exaggerated claims. When it was our turn to speak, I stood up, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I calmly presented our case, explaining that we had simply reinforced our property line, which was clearly documented in our deed, and that we had installed a legal, non-lethal deterrent system to protect against repeated trespass, as permitted by county law. I then held up our deed and survey map, inviting anyone to review them. Jamie chimed in, emphasizing that our only goal was to protect our family's peace and privacy. We spoke about the kindness and empathy we had expected from a community like Willow Creek, and how disheartened we were to find ourselves in this situation. We avoided accusing Carol directly, instead focusing on the principles of respect and legal boundaries. The room was quiet for a moment, absorbing our words. Then, a voice from the back spoke up. It was Mr. Henderson, his usually mild voice surprisingly firm. "Carol," he said, "I recall something similar happening with the O'Malley family years ago. Didn't you try to claim part of their land for a community gazebo, then?" A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Another neighbor, a woman named Sarah, spoke next. "And what about Martha's bird bath? And Robert's oak tree? You've been trying to dictate every tiny thing on people's private property for months now. This isn't about safety, it's about control." The dam had broken. Other residents, emboldened by Mr. Henderson's and Sarah's courage, began to share their own grievances, their voices rising in a chorus of frustration against Carol's overreach. They spoke of petty fines, unreasonable demands, and the constant feeling of being watched and judged. Carol's face turned from red to purple as the complaints mounted. Her carefully constructed facade of authority began to crack, revealing the raw anger beneath. She pounded her gavel, shouting for order, but her control had clearly slipped. The meeting devolved into a chaotic exchange, with residents airing long-suppressed frustrations, effectively turning Carol's carefully planned attack on us into a community-wide airing of grievances against her. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically from apprehension to open rebellion. It became clear that Carol's iron grip on the HOA was far weaker than she imagined, and that her attempts to isolate us had backfired spectacularly. We left the meeting that night, not with a resolution, but with a renewed sense of hope, knowing that we were not alone. But the battle was far from over. Carol, having suffered a public defeat, would undoubtedly be planning her next, more aggressive move. The fiery atmosphere of the HOA meeting lingered, a potent mix of relief and lingering tension. Jamie and I felt a surge of gratitude for our neighbors who had bravely spoken up, turning Carol's public accusation into her public humiliation. Yet, the air still crackled with an unspoken expectation. We all knew Carol wouldn't simply fade away. Her fury, now openly exposed, was a dangerous force. The day after the meeting, a strange quiet descended upon Willow Creek. No more brightly colored notices, no more petty fines. It was almost unsettling, like the eye of a hurricane, making us even more vigilant. We saw Carol's SUV driving by, but she never stopped. Her gaze, however, often lingered on our property, a cold, calculating glint in her eyes. It was clear she was plotting. Jamie and I spent the next few days reinforcing our defenses, not just physically but mentally. We installed a few more discreet, warning signs along our property line, ensuring they were clearly visible from all angles. We even considered investing in security cameras, a step we never thought we'd take in our peaceful suburban haven. The whole experience had hardened us, teaching us that even in the quietest communities, boundaries needed to be fiercely protected. We talked to Mr. Henderson and Sarah, who both reiterated their support. "She's a menace," Martha, another neighbor, told me one afternoon, her voice hushed. "But she won't win. This community is tired of her pushing us around." The shared defiance amongst the neighbors created a new kind of bond, a quiet solidarity against Carol's reign. Then, one brisk autumn morning, the quiet shattered. It began with the distinct sound of heavy machinery, the rumble growing louder as it approached our street. Peeking through the blinds, my blood ran cold. It wasn't Carol's SUV this time. It was a bulldozer, its massive blade glinting in the sunlight, followed by a small caravan of pickup trucks loaded with construction equipment. And there, leading the charge, walking confidently beside the bulldozer as if it were a loyal pet, was Carol. She wore a wide, triumphant grin, her eyes fixed on our backyard. This was it. She wasn't sending letters or calling meetings anymore. She was coming to physically take our land. My heart pounded, a frantic drum in my chest. Jamie rushed to the window, his face paling as he saw the monstrous machine. "She's actually doing it," he breathed, disbelief giving way to a fierce resolve. Carol hadn't just brought contractors, she had brought a wrecking crew. They pulled up right to our property line, the bulldozer idling menacingly, its engine rumbling like a predator. Carol pointed dramatically at our new fence, then at the part of our backyard she wanted. The bulldozer operator, a large man with a thick beard, climbed down from the cab, clipboard in hand, completely ignoring our warning signs. He glanced at Carol, then began to walk directly towards our fence, intending to assess how to tear it down. As the operator, a man named Frank, took his first confident step onto our property, crossing the line marked by the orange stakes, a sudden, powerful jolt shot through him. He let out a loud, startled yell, a sound that echoed through the otherwise silent street. His eyes bulged, and he stumbled back violently, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on his backside, his clipboard flying into the air. He sat there for a moment, completely stunned, rubbing his leg with a bewildered expression. Carol, who had been watching with a smirk, froze, her smile melting into a look of absolute shock. "What was that?" she shrieked, her voice shrill with alarm. The operator, still dazed, pointed a shaky finger at the ground. "Electric. I think it's electric," he stammered, his voice laced with fear. Carol, unwilling to believe it, scoffed. "Nonsense. It's probably just a faulty wire from their ridiculous fence." She then marched forward herself, fueled by a potent mix of disbelief and arrogance, determined to prove him wrong. She stepped directly onto the same spot. This time, the jolt was even more pronounced, a sharp, undeniable crackle audible in the sudden silence. Carol shrieked, a high-pitched, almost comical sound, as she was violently thrown backward, landing ungracefully on her rear end, her expensive suit now covered in dust and a stray leaf. Her perfect bob was disheveled, and her face, usually so composed, was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and fury. She sat there for a moment, stunned, staring at the perfectly innocent grass, then at her tingling backside, then back at our house, her eyes blazing with an unholy mix of rage and baffled humiliation. The other construction workers, who had been watching the scene unfold, now looked at each other, then at the fallen Carol, then back at our property. They started to back away from the property line, clearly wanting nothing to do with an invisible force that threw people onto the ground. Whispers began to spread amongst them, and the bulldozer operator quickly scrambled back into his cab, looking genuinely terrified. Neighbors, drawn out by the commotion, stood on their porches, watching the unfolding spectacle with wide eyes, some struggling to suppress outright laughter. Carol finally managed to scramble to her feet, her face contorted in a terrifying snarl. She pointed a trembling finger at our house. You did this. This is illegal. I'll have you arrested." She screamed, her voice cracking with fury. But her words lacked their usual power, her humiliation had stripped her of her authority. The quiet hum emanating from our property felt like a deep, resonant chuckle. Her contractors were clearly spooked, unwilling to risk another unseen jolt. The bulldozer, once a symbol of her power, now sat idly, a defeated beast. Carol, realizing she had completely lost control of the situation and her crew, let out a frustrated growl, then spun around and stormed back to her SUV, her movements jerky and furious. Her grand, public display of power had utterly backfired, turning into a public, electrifying defeat. The bulldozer, after a moment of confused idling, slowly turned around and lumbered back down the street, its mission abandoned. We watched her drive away, the tension slowly draining from our bodies, replaced by a profound sense of triumph. It was over. The land was safe. The silence that followed was different this time, not the uneasy calm, but a true peace, punctuated by the faint, proud hum of our fences. Willow Creek had seen its share of drama, but this wild ending, orchestrated not by us but by Carol's own unchecked ambition, had truly delivered. The electrified fences had kept them out, not with violence, but with a surprising, unforgettable shock, securing our land and, more importantly, sending a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge the quiet, rightful boundaries of home.